The midsummer fete had drawn the whole of Little Dilling into the vicarage garden, where paper lanterns cast gentle pools of light and the evening air hummed with expectation. Mrs. Clarice Palfrey, who chaired the charity committee with unwavering determination, had announced to anyone within earshot that a London pianist of considerable reputation would perform at the stroke of midnight. The very word midnight lent an air of enchantment to the proceedings, transforming their quiet village gathering into something altogether more theatrical. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably in a wicker chair beside the rose border, her knitting needles working steadily on something pale and practical. She was visiting her dear friend Dora Brett, the vicar's wife, and found herself perfectly positioned to observe the evening's festivities with that gentle, almost apologetic interest that had served her so well over the years. She noticed, as she always did, the subtle interplay of personalities, who smiled without warmth, who looked without seeing, and who managed neither with any conviction. Sebastian Vale arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, and Miss Marple's first impression was that he appeared far from the benevolent artist Mrs. Palfrey had described. He was undeniably elegant, with the grave demeanor that often accompanies rehearsed sincerity. He bowed appropriately to Mrs. Palfrey, shook hands with Reverend Brett, and accepted a glass of lemonade with a distracted smile, as though he had been offered a memory rather than refreshment. His secretary, a nervous little man named Harold Dacre, hovered nearby with a leather portfolio and answered most questions directed at his employer. Miss Marple observed that Mr. Dacre frequently touched his breast pocket, where the corner of a folded letter made its presence known. She glanced once at the pocket, then at Mrs. Palfrey's increasingly bright smile, filing both observations away with practiced discretion. The hired grand piano sat like a dark mirror on the lawn, its polished surface reflecting the lantern light. During the brief rehearsal, the village dogs barked once at the first chord, then resigned themselves to culture. By 10 o'clock, the vicarage garden was crowded with expectant faces. By 11, the children had been settled into borrowed chairs with shawls, and as the church clock began its midnight chimes, Mrs. Palfrey clapped for attention. Sebastian Vale took his place at the instrument, and a hush fell over the gathering. Some in the audience thought of London's grand concert halls. Others found their minds wandering to more mundane concerns. Miss Marple thought of a hedgerow she had once observed, where a single bramble had contrived to look like a rose until its berries betrayed its true nature. The first piece was Beethoven, played with technical precision but curious emotional distance. Miss Marple found herself watching the audience rather than the performer, noting how people revealed themselves most clearly when they believed attention was focused elsewhere. Iris Latimer, the village music teacher, stood behind Mrs. Palfrey with an expression mixing admiration and professional resentment. Colonel Redfern nodded approvingly at the disciplined performance, while Dr. Reeves frowned slightly at the pianist's aggressive wrist technique. During the interval, Miss Marple noticed Sebastian exchange his lemonade glass for another. The substitution was so smooth that she doubted anyone else observed it, but she noted that the lipstick smudge vanished and a faint scent of violets replaced the lemon. The second half began with a modern composition that challenged both performer and audience. As Sebastian's hands moved across the keys with increasing intensity, the night seemed to hold its breath. The final passage rose delicately, then dangerously, building to a crescendo that felt almost too intimate for the garden setting. The last chord struck and held, then slowly faded into the summer night. Sebastian sat perfectly still, as though the music had extracted something essential from him. The audience hesitated, uncertain whether the performance was truly finished, and in that moment of suspended silence, the pianist simply folded forward over the keys. It was not dramatic. No cry of pain, no clutching at his chest. Merely a weary collapse, as though the music had asked for more than he could afford to give. The audience's hesitation turned to murmurs, then to concerned movement as Dr. Reeves pushed through the crowd with professional urgency. "He's gone," the doctor announced quietly to Reverend Brett and Mrs. Palfrey, who nodded because nodding seemed the only appropriate response to such an impossible statement. In the confusion that followed, Miss Marple observed three things that others missed entirely. The glass near the piano had been moved precisely 3 inches, leaving a water ring that intersected exactly with an older, fainter mark. An extra wicker chair had appeared behind the yew hedge, though no additional guest had arrived during the evening. And most curious of all, a program had fluttered to the grass, bearing a smear of something that was neither ink nor lemon juice. Constable Owen Bell arrived, red-faced and apologetic at being roused from near sleep. Reverend Brett asked everyone to remain until matters could be clarified, his grave manner lending authority to the request. Mr. Dacre pressed his lips together and mentioned that Mr. Vale had suffered previous collapses, that artistic temperament could overwhelm even experienced performers, and that perhaps the letter in his pocket might provide relevant information. As the evening dissolved into whispered conferences and shocked speculation, Miss Marple resumed her knitting with characteristic composure. She had noticed that the piano keys still trembled slightly, as though the instrument remembered its player's touch. The lanterns continued their gentle swaying. The owl in the distant field called its repetitive question, and somewhere beyond the hedge, a bicycle wheel ticked as it cooled. The pianist who had played at midnight lay with his hands curved as though resting on invisible keys, and Miss Marple reflected that some performances, like some revelations, came with a price that only became apparent after the final note had sounded. The shock rippled through the garden like disturbed water, spreading in widening circles of whispered disbelief and nervous movement. Dr. Reeves straightened slowly from his examination, his professional composure intact, but his eyes betraying the gravity of the situation. He drew his handkerchief across his brow and addressed Reverend Brett in the measured tones that medical men employ when certainty must be conveyed without causing panic. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done," he said quietly. "Mr. Vale appears to have suffered a massive cardiac episode. The exertion of performance, combined with what I suspect was a pre-existing condition." He gestured toward the still figure at the piano, where Harold Dacre now hovered with the anxious devotion of a faithful servant. Constable Bell, whose usual duties rarely extended beyond bicycle theft and the occasional domestic dispute, fumbled with his notebook while attempting to project an authority he clearly didn't feel. His face had progressed from pink to crimson, and his cap sat askew from nervous adjustments. "Right then," he managed, his voice cracking slightly on the words. "Nobody's to leave until we've got statements. Doctor's orders. Police procedure." Mrs. Palfrey, who had spent the better part of an hour basking in the success of her cultural coup, now found herself confronting the nightmare of any event organizer. Tragedy striking under her careful supervision. "This is dreadful," she whispered to anyone within earshot, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. "Simply dreadful. The newspapers will make such a sensation of it. Poor Mr. Vale, and such a distinguished artist." Miss Marple remained seated in her wicker chair, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm, though her attention was entirely focused on the human drama unfolding around her. She observed how grief and shock manifested differently in each person. Mr. Dacre's theatrical despair, Mrs. Palfrey's mortified concern for reputation, Colonel Redfern's military instinct to impose order. Each reaction revealed character as clearly as fingerprints revealed identity. "He seemed perfectly well during the interval," Iris Latimer offered, her voice carrying the professional authority of the village's music teacher. She stood with her arms folded tightly, as though holding something in. Though I did notice his technique became rather aggressive during the final piece, as if he were fighting the instrument rather than playing it. Dr. Reeves nodded thoughtfully. "Artistic temperament often masks physical distress. The Adrenaline of performance can override the body's warning signals. He paused, studying the scene around the piano with the systematic attention of a man accustomed to reading signs others missed. "Mr. Dacre, I believe you mentioned that Mr. Vale had been under a physician's care." Harold Dacre started, his hand instinctively moving to his breast pocket where the corner of the folded letter still showed. Yes indeed. Dr. Hartwell in Harley Street. Heart palpitations, you understand. Mr. Vale was prescribed digitalis, though he was most reluctant to take it regularly. Said it made him feel disconnected from the music. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. She had noticed during the interval how Sebastian Vale had exchanged his lemonade glass for another, the movement so smooth and practiced that it suggested familiarity rather than accident. The violet scent that had replaced the lemon fragrance now seemed less mysterious and more significant. "Did he take his medication this evening?" Dr. Reeves inquired with professional thoroughness. I believe so," Dacre replied, though his uncertainty was evident. He was very private about such matters. Said it was undignified for an artist to be seen taking pills. Colonel Redfern, who had appointed himself unofficial coordinator of the evening's crisis, cleared his throat with military precision. "Bell, we'll need to notify the proper authorities. This isn't a matter for village constables. We'll need the inspector from Stourton." "Already thought of that, sir," Bell replied with obvious relief at having clear direction. "I'll telephone straight away." As the constable hurried toward the vicarage, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander toward the yew hedge where she had earlier noticed the extra wicker chair. The shadows there seemed deeper now, more secretive, and she could just make out the faint impression in the soft earth where someone had stood for an extended period. A bicycle wheel's track was visible in the dust, overlapping with the sharper impression of a heel that had pivoted suddenly. Mrs. Brett approached with a tea tray, her gentle manner unchanged despite the evening's dramatic turn. "Such a tragedy," she murmured to Miss Marple. "And he seemed so composed, so professional. One would never have suspected he was unwell." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, accepting a cup with gracious thanks. "Though I couldn't help noticing during the performance that he seemed more interested in studying the audience than acknowledging their appreciation, almost as though he were looking for someone in particular." This observation caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere around them. Iris Latimer's teacup rattled against its saucer, and Mr. Dacre's nervous fidgeting intensified. Even Mrs. Palfrey, despite her preoccupation with the evening's social disaster, seemed to register the implication. "Now that you mention it," Mrs. Brett said slowly, "he did spend considerable time during the interval scanning faces rather than accepting compliments. I assumed it was nervousness. Some performers find intimate audiences more challenging than large anonymous ones." Miss Marple nodded agreeably, though privately she reflected that Sebastian Vale had displayed none of the typical signs of stage fright. His hands had been steady, his posture confident, and his interaction with the piano had suggested complete familiarity. Whatever had captured his attention during those final moments, it had not been performance anxiety. The sound of approaching footsteps announced Constable Bell's return, accompanied by a man Miss Marple didn't recognize. A thin, nervous individual who introduced himself as Dr. Hartwell's assistant, summoned by telephone to collect Mr. Vale's personal effects and provide medical history. "Most irregular," the assistant was saying as he approached the group. "Mr. Vale was scheduled for a consultation next week. His condition was stable, well managed. This is quite unexpected." Dr. Reeves exchanged a meaningful look with Colonel Redfern. Nevertheless, given the circumstances, a public death, a visiting performer, the coroner will require a full examination. Nothing can be moved until the inspector arrives. As if summoned by these words, the distant sound of a motor car announced the arrival of official authority. The village fete, which had begun with such promise and ended in tragedy, was about to become something else entirely. the scene of an investigation that would strip away the comfortable pretenses of village life and reveal the secrets that lay beneath its carefully maintained surface. Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her knitting resumed, her expression serene. She had seen enough of human nature to know that death, particularly unexpected death, had a way of illuminating truths that the living preferred to keep hidden. The evening had provided several interesting details: the violet powder on the program, the precisely positioned glass, the mysterious chair behind the hedge, and she suspected that before long these small observations would prove to be pieces of a much larger and more complex puzzle. The lanterns continued their gentle swaying in the night breeze, casting dancing shadows across the garden where music had so recently filled the air. Now there was only the murmur of hushed voices and the soft scratch of Miss Marple's knitting needles, keeping time like a metronome as the first act of a very different kind of performance began to unfold. The motor car's arrival was announced by the purposeful crunch of gravel, and Inspector Finch stepped out with the measured efficiency of a man who had spent 2 decades transforming village tragedies into orderly reports. He was tall and spare, with weathered features that suggested long familiarity with human nature's darker impulses, and he moved through the garden with the careful attention of someone who understood that first impressions often proved most reliable. "Dr. Reeves, I presume," he said, extending his hand with professional courtesy. "I've had Constable Bell's preliminary report. Natural causes, you believe?" Dr. Reeves met his gaze with the steady composure of a village physician accustomed to bearing difficult news. "Cardiac arrest, certainly, though I must emphasize that a proper post-mortem will be required to determine the exact mechanism. Mr. Vale was under treatment for heart palpitations, according to his secretary here." Inspector Finch's attention shifted to Harold Dacre, who remained close to his employer's shrouded form with the devotion of a faithful guardian. The secretary's nervous energy was palpable, his hands alternately smoothing his waistcoat and touching the breast pocket where the folded letter still peeped out like a shy conspirator. "Mr. Dacre, I understand you managed Mr. Vale's personal affairs. How long had you been in his employ?" "3 years, Inspector," Dacre replied, his voice carrying the strain of the evening's events. "Mr. Vale was most particular about his arrangements, his medications, his dietary requirements, his performance conditions. I handled all practical matters so he could focus entirely on his art." "And his heart condition? You mentioned prescribed medication." Dacre's hand moved unconsciously to his pocket again. "Digitalis, prescribed by Dr. Hartwell in London. Mr. Vale was resistant to taking it regularly. He claimed it dulled his artistic sensitivity, interfered with his connection to the music." Miss Marple found this exchange particularly illuminating, not for what was said, but for the careful way Dacre's eyes avoided direct contact while discussing his employer's medical compliance. She had observed enough conversations to recognize the subtle choreography of concealment. Inspector Finch made several notes before turning his methodical attention to the scene itself. He examined the piano, the bench, the scattered sheet music with the thoroughness of a man who trusted nothing to assumption. The performance proceeded normally until the final moments? "Magnificently," Mrs. Palfrey interjected, her voice still carrying the shock of seeing her carefully orchestrated evening transformed into tragedy. Such passion, such technical brilliance. The audience was completely captivated until... She gestured helplessly toward the piano. "I noticed he seemed particularly intense during the final piece," Iris Latimer added, her professional musician's ear lending authority to her observation. The modern composition was quite demanding, both technically and emotionally. Perhaps the strain proved overwhelming. Inspector Finch nodded thoughtfully, then surprised the gathering by addressing Miss Marple directly. "You were seated quite close to the performance area, I believe. Did you notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with the mild surprise of someone unaccustomed to official attention. "Nothing that others haven't mentioned, Inspector. though I did observe that Mr. Vale seemed more interested in studying faces than acknowledging applause during the interval, rather like someone expecting to recognize an acquaintance in the crowd. This observation caused a subtle ripple of unease among the villagers. Colonel Redfern cleared his throat with military disapproval, while Mrs. Palfrey's eyebrows rose in the manner of someone who had personally overseen the guest arrangements. "Did he speak to anyone in particular during the interval?" Finch inquired, his notebook poised. "Only to accept refreshments and acknowledge compliments," Dacre replied quickly. Mr. Vale was quite reserved in social situations. Professional courtesy, nothing more. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she considered this response. While technically accurate, it omitted the curious business of the exchanged lemonade glasses, a substitution so smooth and practiced that it suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate intent. Inspector Finch continued his examination, moving toward the refreshment area, where 2 glasses still rested on the small table beside the piano. He lifted one by the rim with his handkerchief and sniffed delicately, his expression revealing nothing. "Curious scent," he murmured, glancing toward Miss Marple. "Not lemons." "Violets," she replied mildly, as though discussing the weather. "My late aunt was devoted to that particular fragrance. It has a way of lingering." Dr. Reeves stepped closer, his medical training engaged. "If I may, Inspector, perfume could easily mask other substances, and for a man with a compromised heart, certain compounds could prove accelerating." "Accelerating?" Finch repeated thoughtfully, the word carrying weight beyond its syllables. He carefully bagged the glass, then turned his attention to the area behind the yew hedge, where Miss Marple had earlier noticed the extra wicker chair. "Belle, bring your torch," he instructed, and together they examined the shadowed space. The beam revealed scuffed earth, the clear impression of bicycle tires, and most intriguingly, a dark leather portfolio tucked behind the chair leg. "Mr. Dacre," Finch called, "is this yours?" Dacre approached with obvious reluctance, his face paling as he recognized his property. "Yes, Inspector. I must have set it down during the interval when someone called to me about some matter regarding the piano delivery." Finch opened the portfolio carefully, revealing a jumble of papers in hasty disorder. "Is anything missing?" Dacre's fingers trembled as he sorted through the contents. "The digitalis bottle?" he whispered. "It was here, I'm certain. And there was a letter. A personal correspondence. It's gone." "What sort of personal correspondence?" Finch's tone remained casual, but Miss Marple noted the sharpened attention behind his professional manner. A private matter," Dacre stammered. "Nothing relevant to tonight's tragedy, I assure you." Finch closed the portfolio and handed it to Constable Bell. "We'll determine relevance in due course. For now, I want this entire area cordoned off." As he returned to the piano, his torch beam caught something delicate in the wicker chair's rough weaving. A single thread, pale and faintly luminous. Miss Marple, moving with the quiet step of one accustomed to gardens at all hours, joined him at the discovery. "Mauve," she observed gently, as Finch carefully extracted the strand. "Such a forgiving color to certain complexions, though it can be quite revealing in other circumstances." The inspector smiled slightly at her understated observation. "Indeed, and bicycle tracks suggest someone arrived by an unconventional route, someone who preferred not to be seen at the main gate." As the evening's investigation continued, Miss Marple found herself considering the accumulating details: the violet-scented glass, the missing digitalis, the mysterious letter, the thread caught in wicker, and most significantly, the deliberate positioning of that extra chair behind the hedge. Someone had planned to observe tonight's performance from concealment, someone who had come prepared with more than mere curiosity. The pianist who had played at midnight was dead, but Miss Marple suspected that the real composition, one of deception, revenge, and carefully orchestrated murder, was only beginning to reveal its true complexity. In villages, she reflected, motives were often neighborly affairs, small and persistent as bindweed, growing quietly until they strangled what they encountered. The lanterns continued their gentle swaying in the night breeze, but their cheerful light now illuminated a scene transformed from celebration to investigation, where every shadow might conceal a secret, and every innocent gesture might mask a deadly intent. Inspector Finch methodically separated the witnesses into manageable groups, understanding that shock often gave way to revelation in the quiet hours following tragedy. The garden, still fragrant with summer blooms despite the night's grim turn, provided an incongruously peaceful setting for what was rapidly becoming a murder investigation rather than a simple medical emergency. Mrs. Palfrey, Finch began, his notebook poised with professional precision. As tonight's organizer, you would have overseen all the arrangements. Walk me through the preparations, particularly regarding the refreshment area and piano placement. Mrs. Palfrey straightened with the dignity of someone whose organizational skills had never before been questioned by authority. The piano arrived yesterday afternoon from Harrington's in Stourton. Such a production it was. Colonel Redfern supervised the positioning, naturally with his military expertise. Dr. Reeves stopped by during his rounds, and Miss Latimer was quite insistent about the acoustics. Her voice carried a subtle edge when mentioning the music teacher, suggesting professional tensions beneath village courtesy, who had access to the refreshment table during the performance itself. The charity committee ladies took turns, Mrs. Thornby, Mrs. Wickham, and myself, though during the actual performance, attention was focused entirely on Mr. Vale's magnificent playing. Anyone might have approached unnoticed. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm as she observed the subtle interplay of glances between the assembled villagers. Harold Dacre's nervous energy was particularly pronounced, his hand repeatedly moving to his breast pocket in a gesture that spoke of habitual anxiety rather than casual fidgeting. Inspector Finch turned his attention to Iris Latimer, whose pale complexion and tightly clasped hands suggested emotional strain beyond simple shock. Miss Latimer, as our local music teacher, you would have professional interest in tonight's performance. What were your impressions of Mr. Vale? Iris lifted her chin with a defiance that seemed practiced. Technically proficient, but emotionally calculated, Inspector. His approach to music was intellectual rather than artistic, until the final piece, when something quite different emerged. The transformation was so pronounced that I wondered if he was experiencing some form of distress. Your shawl, Finch observed with studied casualness. Is it mauve by any chance? The question created a moment of crystalline silence. Yes, though I failed to see the relevance. I arrived by bicycle at 9:30 and stood with Mrs. Palfrey during most of the performance. I did misplace the shawl at some point, but I hardly imagine it wandered off by itself. Miss Marple noticed the faint bloom of violet powder on Iris's wrist, where a hand had brushed absent-mindedly, and filed this observation alongside the program's earlier smear and the mysterious scent that had replaced lemon in Sebastian's glass. Dr. Reeves stepped forward with medical authority. Inspector, Miss Latimer's assessment aligns with my own observations. Mr. Vale's performance seemed almost mechanical until the final composition, when his technique became aggressively passionate. For a man with a compromised heart, such emotional intensity could prove dangerous. Harold Dacre, pressed for details about his employer's medical regimen, wrung his hands with increasing agitation. Mr. Vale was prescribed digitalis by Dr. Hartwell in London, but he was most reluctant to take it regularly. Said it dulled his artistic sensitivity, interfered with his connection to the music. I refilled the bottle yesterday. It was nearly full. Did he take his medication before tonight's performance? Dacre's eyes flickered toward the refreshment table, then away. He told me he had, though if he changed his mind, I cannot say with certainty. Miss Marple remembered the exchange of glasses she had witnessed, so smooth and practiced that it suggested either Remarkable coincidence or deliberate choreography? The violet scent that had replaced lemon seemed increasingly significant when considered alongside Mr. Vale's particular habits regarding hydration. "Mr. Dacre," she interjected gently, "you mentioned that Mr. Vale was particular about his performance conditions. Did that extend to his refreshments?" "Indeed, Miss Marple. He always used filtered water or lemonade prepared to his exact specifications. He was extraordinarily sensitive to taste and insisted on his personal glass being positioned precisely 6 inches to the left of the music stand." Inspector Finch's attention sharpened. "And this personal glass, where is it now?" The question hung in the garden air like morning mist. The 2 glasses on the refreshment table bore no resemblance to Dacre's description of Vale's particular requirements, and the secretary's obvious confusion suggested that something had gone seriously amiss with the evening's careful arrangements. In the confusion following Mr. Vale's collapse, I'm afraid such details escaped my attention," Dacre stammered, his composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated inconsistencies. Colonel Redfern cleared his throat with military authority. "Inspector, might I suggest a systematic search of the grounds? Items could have been discarded, either accidentally or deliberately." As Constable Bell began his methodical examination with torch and determination, Mrs. Brett approached Miss Marple with a gentle manner that often encouraged unexpected confidences. "Such a strange evening," she murmured, refilling Miss Marple's teacup. Mr. Vale seemed watchful from the moment he arrived. Not nervous, but alert in the way of someone expecting trouble rather than applause. During the interval, when Mrs. Thornby complimented his technique, he asked the most peculiar question about whether she remembered a family named Hartwell who had lived here some years ago. This revelation cast the evening's events in an entirely different light. Miss Marple reflected that traveling performers often carried personal histories that intersected unexpectedly with the communities they visited, creating motives that had nothing to do with artistic temperament or medical conditions. "Bell's found something," Colonel Redfern's voice carried across the garden with military precision. The constable was crouched beside the garden pond, his torch beam illuminating something partially submerged among the water lilies. He carefully extracted a small glass vial, its pharmaceutical label partially dissolved, but still legible enough to reveal the word digitalis in faded print. Inspector Finch examined the vial with professional interest. "Empty, and recently so. There's still residue clinging to the sides." Harold Dacre stared at the bottle with an expression mixing recognition and bewilderment. "That's definitely from Mr. Vale's medical kit, Inspector. But I checked his supplies this morning. That bottle was nearly full." The implications settled over the garden like dew, visible but not yet fully formed. Miss Marple continued her knitting with serene composure, but her mind was actively cataloguing the accumulating evidence: the violet-scented glass, the missing correspondence, the empty digitalis vial, the mysterious bicycle tracks, and now the suggestion that Sebastian Vale had been seeking information about the Hartwell family. In her experience, when past and present collided in small villages, the results were rarely accidental and never simple. Someone had come to tonight's performance with purposes extending far beyond musical appreciation, and Sebastian Vale's death was beginning to appear less like tragic coincidence and more like the carefully orchestrated finale of a much longer and more complex composition. The morning light continued to strengthen, transforming the scene from mysterious shadows to stark reality, where every detail would soon demand explanation, and every secret would struggle to remain hidden. The empty digitalis vial cast a shadow of deliberate intent across the morning garden, transforming what had appeared to be tragic coincidence into something far more sinister. Inspector Finch held the small bottle with professional gravity, his weathered features reflecting the weight of evidence that pointed inexorably toward murder rather than misfortune. Dr. Reeves stepped closer, his medical training engaged by the pharmaceutical implications. "Inspector, Digitalis in therapeutic doses strengthens irregular heartbeat, but in excessive quantities it becomes profoundly toxic. The progression would be swift: visual disturbances, nausea, then complete cardiac arrest. For someone already taking the medication, the margin between therapeutic and lethal doses becomes dangerously narrow. Harold Dacre's face had assumed the pallor of old parchment, his nervous energy now channeled into desperate protestation. "Inspector, that bottle was nearly full when I checked it yesterday evening. I've managed Mr. Vale's medical requirements for 3 years. I would never compromise his health. The medication was kept in his dressing room at the vicarage, precisely as Dr. Hartwell prescribed." "And yet," Finch observed with methodical precision, "this bottle was in your portfolio, which was found behind the hedge where someone had been observing tonight's performance. You also mentioned a missing letter, correspondence that might provide motive for silencing Mr. Vale." The secretary's hands trembled as he touched his breast pocket reflexively. "The letter was personal, Inspector. Ancient history, really. Someone from Mr. Vale's past, before he achieved his current reputation. It requested a meeting during the interval, signed only with an initial. I thought it harmless enough, though Mr. Vale seemed unsettled by it." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm, but her attention was entirely focused on the subtle interplay of revelation and concealment. Dacre's distress appeared genuine, yet she had observed the smooth exchange of glasses during the interval, a substitution so practiced that it suggested either remarkable coincidence or intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. Mrs. Brett approached with characteristic gentleness, carrying a tea tray that somehow managed to restore a semblance of normalcy to the extraordinary circumstances. "Inspector, while preparing the rooms yesterday, I noticed that Mr. Vale was quite particular about his refreshment requirements. He insisted on a specific type of glass, heavy crystal with a weighted base, positioned precisely to the left of his music stand." This detail caused Inspector Finch to examine the refreshment area with renewed interest. The 2 glasses remaining on the table bore no resemblance to Mrs. Brett's description, and their ordinary appearance suggested that the performer's particular requirements had been either overlooked or deliberately circumvented. "Mr. Dacre," Finch continued, "where is Mr. Vale's preferred glass now?" The question hung in the morning air like mist, revealing the secretary's obvious confusion. In the confusion following his collapse, such details escaped my attention. But he was most insistent about using his own glassware. Said it affected the taste of everything he drank." Colonel Redfern, whose military training had instilled an appreciation for systematic investigation, cleared his throat with authority. "Inspector, might I suggest a thorough search of the grounds? If items have been discarded, either accidentally or deliberately, they should be recoverable." As Constable Bell began his methodical examination with torch and determination, Mrs. Palfrey approached Miss Marple with the nervous energy of someone seeking reassurance from an unexpected source. "Such a dreadful business," she whispered, her voice carrying the strain of seeing her carefully orchestrated evening transform into tragedy. "Mr. Vale seemed so professional, so composed. Though I must say, during the interval he asked the most peculiar question about whether I remembered a family named Hartwell who had lived in the village some years ago." This revelation caused Miss Marple's needles to pause momentarily. "The Hartwells?" she inquired with gentle interest. "I believe Reverend Brett mentioned them earlier, a schoolmaster's family who left rather suddenly." Mrs. Brett, overhearing the conversation, joined them with the careful manner of someone who understood that village history often contained sensitive undercurrents. There was indeed a Hartwell family here, perhaps 15 years ago. The father taught at the village school, and there was a daughter, Lucinda, though everyone called her Lucy. Quite musical, as I recall. There was some unpleasantness about missing church funds, though the matter was eventually resolved. They departed rather abruptly after that. "And what became of the daughter?" Miss Marple inquired with the mild curiosity that often encouraged unexpected confidences. She married, I believe, a man named Latimer from Stourton. There was a talk of a disappointment, a young musician with London connections who had courted her before disappearing without explanation. Such things leave lasting impressions on sensitive natures. The implications of this information settled over the group like morning dew, visible but not yet fully formed. Miss Marple found herself considering the curious intersection of past and present that seemed to characterize the evening's tragic events. Inspector Finch, meanwhile, had focused his attention on the physical evidence with professional thoroughness. "Dr. Reeves, in your opinion, how would someone unfamiliar with digitalis dosage determine a lethal amount?" They would need either medical knowledge or access to pharmaceutical references. The margin for error is quite small. Too little would produce no effect, while too much would be immediately obvious to the victim through taste and immediate symptoms. Unless, Miss Marple observed quietly, the taste were disguised by something equally distinctive. Violet perfume, for instance, has a way of overwhelming other flavors while seeming quite innocent. This observation caused a subtle shift in the investigation's focus. Constable Bell, who had been systematically searching the garden's perimeter, called out with obvious excitement, "Inspector, I found something near the kitchen garden, a small compact, silver with an engraved initial. The powder inside has a distinctive scent." Miss Marple accepted the compact with the careful attention of someone examining a piece of evidence rather than a cosmetic accessory. The initial L was clearly visible on the cover, and the violet-scented powder within bore traces of something that was decidedly not rouge. "How curious," she murmured, though her tone suggested the discovery was less surprising than illuminating. Such a personal item to misplace during a musical performance. Inspector Finch examined the compact with professional interest, noting the way the powder had been disturbed and the faint residue that clung to the applicator. This could certainly account for the violet scent we've encountered throughout this investigation. As the morning light continued to strengthen, transforming shadows into clear details, Miss Marple reflected that the evening's tragedy was revealing layers of deception and motivation that extended far beyond simple coincidence. Someone had come to the performance with purposes that transcended musical appreciation, and Sebastian Vale's death was beginning to appear as the culmination of a much longer and more complex composition. The pianist who had played at midnight was indeed dead, but the true performance, one of revenge, deception, and carefully orchestrated murder, was only beginning to reveal its intricate structure to those with the patience and insight to read its hidden score. The silver compact rested in Inspector Finch's palm like a small confession, its engraved initial catching the strengthening morning light with quiet accusation. The violet-scented powder within bore traces of something decidedly more sinister than rouge, and the careful way it had been disturbed suggested deliberate rather than accidental use. Iris Latimer stood beside the refreshment table with the peculiar stillness of someone watching their carefully constructed world examined under official scrutiny. Her hands, which had earlier moved with nervous energy, now hung at her sides with the defeated posture of someone who understood that explanations would soon be required. "Miss Latimer," Inspector Finch said with professional courtesy that carried undertones of inexorable authority, "I believe this compact belongs to you." She lifted her chin with a defiance that seemed more habitual than hopeful. "It might be mine, Inspector, though many ladies possess similar items. I may have dropped it during the confusion following Mr. Vale's collapse." Her voice carried the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed reasonable explanations. Miss Marple observed this exchange with the gentle attention of someone who understood that truth often emerged through patient excavation rather than dramatic revelation. The music teacher's response was technically plausible, yet it failed to account for the strategic location of the discovery or the compound's deadly sophistication. "The powder inside," Finch continued with methodical persistence, "appears to contain more than cosmetic ingredients. Dr. Reeves, would you examine this, please?" The village physician accepted the compact with professional gravity, touching a small amount to his tongue before immediately reaching for his handkerchief with obvious distaste. Digitalis, certainly, though cleverly disguised with violet powder and rouge. The bitter taste would be largely masked by the perfume's intensity, and the familiar appearance would deflect suspicion. Quite ingenious, really. Harold Dacre stared at the compact with recognition dawning in his features. "Inspector, that explains the violet scent I noticed during the interval." Mr. Vale commented on it specifically, said it reminded him of someone from his past, though he seemed more nostalgic than alarmed. Mrs. Brett, whose gentle manner often encouraged unexpected confidences, approached with characteristic compassion. "Inspector, if I may, while preparing the rooms yesterday, our maid Mabel mentioned something rather curious. Perhaps she should speak for herself." The young maid appeared with obvious reluctance, her cheeks pink with the effort of not seeming important. "Beg pardon, sir." She addressed Inspector Finch with downcast eyes. "But Mrs. Brett said you might want to know about the glass I washed last night." "Describe this glass, please," Finch encouraged with professional patience. "Heavy at the bottom, sir, like it wanted to sit still. I was going up with extra shawls when someone was in the scullery with the light very low. She put it by the sink and said, 'Just that one, if you please,' and slipped away, quick-like. Could you identify this person?" Mabel frowned, trying to construct a face from shadows and impressions. "She had a soft voice, sir. Smelt like violets, she did, and her shawl caught at the door latch. Mauve, it looked to me, and pulling threads, something dreadful." This testimony created a moment of crystalline silence in the garden, where morning light was steadily transforming shadows into stark evidence. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm as she considered how domestic observations often proved more revealing than official statements. Inspector Finch made careful notes before addressing the growing web of evidence. "Miss Latimer, we've established that someone wearing a mauve shawl, which you've acknowledged misplacing, was present in the scullery, washing what appears to be Mr. Vale's preferred performance glass. The same person left violet scent and asked specifically for discretion." Iris Latimer's composure began showing hairline cracks under the weight of accumulated implication. "Inspector, I won't deny familiarity with Mr. Vale's requirements. As the village music teacher, I naturally took professional interest in ensuring his comfort." "Professional interest that extended to private correspondence?" Finch pressed gently. "Mr. Dacre mentioned a letter requesting an interval meeting, signed with an initial that appears to match your compact." The music teacher's defiance finally crumbled into something approaching honesty. "Inspector, I knew Sebastian Vale before tonight's performance. Many years ago, when I was Lucy Hartwell and he was an ambitious young musician seeking patronage in London." Mrs. Brett nodded with sudden understanding. "Of course, Lucinda Hartwell, who married Mr. Latimer from Stourton. There was talk of a disappointment involving a young musician who had courted her before disappearing without explanation." "He promised marriage," Iris continued with obvious difficulty, "then vanished when a more advantageous opportunity presented itself. I married Mr. Latimer afterward, a kind man who deserved better than someone whose heart remained elsewhere." Miss Marple found this revelation illuminating, though she suspected important elements remained concealed. "And when you learned he would be performing here tonight?" "I thought it might provide closure, a chance to demonstrate that I had built a successful life despite his abandonment. Instead, seeing him again brought back all the old pain, the sense of being discarded when someone more useful appeared." Inspector Finch examined the piano with renewed interest, running his finger along the lower keys. "There's a slight residue here," he observed, "something that binds to moisture. Dr. Reeves?" The physician bent to examine the keys, then straightened with professional concern. "Violet powder, certainly, but applied deliberately to create consistent scent near the performer's face. It would mask any bitterness from contaminated refreshment while appearing entirely innocent. Like the final bars of a piece one has known too well." Iris said quietly from the doorway, her voice carrying resigned acceptance. "You don't realize you're at the end until the silence arrives." The confession hung in the morning air like mist, revealing the emotional landscape that had shaped the evening's tragic events. Yet Miss Marple sensed that while Iris Latimer possessed motive and opportunity, the intricate deception suggested layers of planning that extended beyond simple revenge. The seamless exchange of glasses, the precise timing, the calculated dosage, these elements spoke of colder calculation than passionate betrayal typically produced. Inspector Finch closed his notebook with professional finality. "Miss Latimer, I must ask you to accompany me to the station for formal questioning. The evidence suggests premeditated action rather than spontaneous confrontation." As the investigation moved toward its next phase, Miss Marple reflected that village secrets, like garden weeds, often grew in unexpected directions, intertwining with other lives in ways that made simple solutions deceptively complex. The pianist who had played at midnight was indeed dead, but the true composition of guilt and innocence remained to be fully revealed. As Inspector Finch prepared to escort Iris Latimer from the vicarage garden, Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm, though her mind was actively cataloguing the inconsistencies that troubled her like thorns in otherwise perfect roses. The confession, while emotionally satisfying to the assembled villagers, left practical questions that her years of observing human nature suggested were too significant to overlook. "Inspector," she said with characteristic mildness, "might I ask Miss Latimer one small question before you depart?" Finch paused, recognizing in Miss Marple's tone the quality that had previously proved illuminating. "Of course." Miss Marple addressed Iris with gentle curiosity. "My dear, you mentioned applying violet powder to the piano keys and exchanging glasses during the interval. Yet you stood quite close to Mrs. Palfrey throughout the evening, discussing the performance with the other ladies. When exactly did you have opportunity for such elaborate preparations?" The question created a moment of crystalline silence in the garden, where morning light continued to transform shadows into stark clarity. Iris Latimer's face reflected genuine confusion rather than the trapped desperation of someone whose deception had been exposed. During the interval, I suppose. Though now that you mention it, Mrs. Palfrey was quite insistent about maintaining proper positions for the photography she had planned. The powder application alone would have required several minutes of privacy with the instrument. Dr. Reeves stepped forward with medical authority. "Inspector, there's another consideration. The digitalis dosage we're discussing would require precise pharmaceutical knowledge. Too little would produce no effect, while too much would be immediately obvious despite the violet masking. Someone with Miss Latimer's background would lack such expertise." Harold Dacre, who had been following this exchange with growing agitation, suddenly pressed his hand to his breast pocket with obvious alarm. "Inspector, the letter, I've just remembered something crucial." The handwriting wasn't feminine script at all, but rather masculine, though deliberately disguised. And the paper was expensive stock, the sort used for professional correspondence. This revelation cast the morning's assumptions in an entirely different light. As Inspector Finch reopened his notebook with professional thoroughness, Colonel Redfern emerged from the shrubbery bearing a discovery held carefully in 2 fingers. "Found this under the hydrangeas," he announced, presenting a heavy crystal glass with a weighted base. "Looks like the sort our pianist fancied." Dr. Reeves examined the glass with professional interest. "Violets again, and lemon. No visible residue, but the rim shows a faint tide mark, as if the contents were topped up rather than freshly poured." Miss Marple observed the positioning as Colonel Redfern placed the glass on the iron table, noting how his heel left a sharp pivot impression in the soft earth, remarkably similar to the mysterious tracks she had noticed during the night's investigation. Mrs. Brett approached with information that seemed to weigh heavily on her conscience. "Inspector, Dr. Hartwell's assistant. The gentleman who arrived to collect Mr. Vale's effects seemed remarkably familiar with the garden's layout for someone claiming to be visiting for the first time. Harold Dacre straightened with obvious recognition. "Inspector, I've managed Mr. Vale's appointments for 3 years. His physician was Dr. Harrison in Wimpole Street. I've never heard of anyone named Hartwell in connection with his medical care." The implications settled over the investigation like morning mist. Someone had arrived claiming medical authority they didn't possess, displaying intimate knowledge that suggested long-standing surveillance rather than professional relationship. As Constable Bell continued his methodical search, he called out from behind the yew hedge. "Inspector, found something else. A bicycle lamp ticket from a Stourton repair shop, and there's been a small fire here." The group gathered around the scorched remains of what had been the extra wicker chair. Bell carefully extracted a partially burned letter fragment, its edges blackened but several lines still legible. "Or the sake of the name we shared. Meet at the hedge by the IU," Miss Marple read softly. "The initial is gone, but the phrasing is most illuminating." Dr. Reeves leaned closer. "The name we shared. That suggests kinship rather than romance." Dacre swallowed hard, his composure finally cracking under accumulated revelations. "Mr. Vale's birth name was not Vale, Inspector. He was born Sebastian Hart. He adopted the stage name in London, though he once told me he preferred to be of the Vale than of the Plain." Mrs. Palfrey, who had remained unusually quiet during these discoveries, now stepped forward with nervous energy. "Such a dreadful business," she murmured, though Miss Marple noticed the faint dusting of violet powder on her right glove and the way her movements carried that distinctive scent. "You've a little powder there, dear," Miss Marple remarked with gentle concern. "The hedge does take liberties with one's clothing." Mrs. Palfrey glanced down and brushed at the glove with unnecessary vigor. "New compact, rather extravagant for a charity organizer, but one must make an effort." From within the vicarage came the sharp trill of the telephone. Mrs. Brett hurried inside, returning moments later with heightened color. It was for Miss Latimer, a woman from Stourton, asking if the arrangement held and whether the man suffered as he deserved. When I explained Miss Latimer wasn't available, the caller rang off immediately. Miss Marple's needles paused in their rhythm. A listener rather than a speaker. Such people often take more than they give. As the morning light strengthened, revealing details that darkness had concealed, Miss Marple reflected that the evening's tragedy was exposing layers of deception extending far beyond simple revenge. The empty digitalis vial, the precisely positioned evidence, the mysterious assistant with false credentials, the burned correspondence, these elements spoke of calculated planning rather than passionate impulse. "Inspector," she said with quiet authority, "I believe Miss Latimer has been most cleverly positioned to bear responsibility for crimes she lacks both the knowledge and opportunity to commit. The real composer of this deadly performance remains at large, hidden behind a veil of convenient assumptions and misdirection." Inspector Finch nodded slowly, understanding that his investigation had only begun to uncover the true complexity of the pianist's death. Someone with medical expertise, intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, and access to pharmaceutical supplies had orchestrated a murder designed to frame an innocent woman while concealing their own deadly intentions. The pianist who had played at midnight was indeed dead, but the real performance, one of deception, calculation, and carefully orchestrated revenge, was only beginning to reveal its intricate score to those with patience and insight, enough to read between its deceptively simple lines. The revelation of the medical bag bearing Edmund Hartwell's credentials cast a shadow of professional deception across the investigation, suggesting someone with genuine pharmaceutical knowledge operating under assumed identity. Inspector Finch examined the bag's contents with methodical precision, noting the comprehensive array of medications that spoke to extensive medical training rather than casual familiarity with healing art. Miss Marple observed this development with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth often emerged through careful excavation of seemingly unrelated details. The mysterious Dr. Hartwell possessed not only medical expertise, but intimate knowledge of the village's geography and the victim's personal habits, a combination that suggested long-standing surveillance rather than recent acquaintance. Mrs. Brett approached with information gleaned from her systematic tidying of the guest quarters. "Inspector, while preparing Mr. Vale's room this morning, I discovered something rather peculiar tucked behind the washstand. A small leather portfolio containing correspondence dating back several years. The letters appear to be from someone signing themselves E.H. and reference matters of considerable personal importance." Harold Dacre accepted the portfolio with trembling hands, his face reflecting recognition tinged with apprehension. "These are private communications, Inspector. Matters Mr. Vale preferred not to discuss." The correspondent claimed kinship, though Mr. Vale always maintained he had no living relatives. "Claimed kinship," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, her knitting needles pausing in their rhythm. "Such claims often arise from circumstances that official records fail to capture. Illegitimate connections, adoptions, family secrets. Villages are repositories of such knowledge, passed down through generations like heirloom recipes." Inspector Finch studied the correspondence with professional thoroughness, noting the progression from cordial inquiry to increasingly urgent demands. "These letters span 3 years, Mr. Dacre. The writer references debts of honor and recognition long overdue. Did Mr. Vale ever explain the nature of these obligations?" Dacre's composure finally cracked under the weight of accumulated secrets. He said only that some mistakes cast longer shadows than others, and that success often required forgetting inconvenient truths. When the letters began arriving, he became increasingly anxious about public appearances in smaller venues. Dr. Reeves, who had been examining the medical bag's pharmaceutical contents, looked up with professional concern. "Inspector, this collection represents a complete portable surgery, digitalis in multiple concentrations, morphine, strychnine, and several compounds I don't immediately recognize, far beyond what any legitimate physician would carry for routine house calls." The implications settled over the garden like morning mist, visible but not yet fully formed. Someone with extensive medical knowledge had been orchestrating events from behind a veil of assumed authority, using professional credentials to gain access while concealing deadly intentions. Mrs. Palfrey, whose nervous energy had been building throughout the morning's revelations, approached with the defensive posture of someone whose carefully constructed world was being systematically examined. "Inspector, I must protest this continued disruption of our peaceful community. Surely Mr. Vale's death was simply a tragic medical episode, regardless of these mysterious letters and suspicious strangers." Miss Marple found this protestation curious, particularly given Mrs. Palfrey's earlier enthusiasm for the investigation's progress. "Indeed, my dear, though I couldn't help noticing during last evening's performance that you seemed particularly attentive to Mr. Vale's refreshment requirements. Such thoughtful hospitality speaks well of your organizational skills." The compliment caused Mrs. Palfrey to flush with what might have been pleasure or discomfort. "Naturally, Inspector. A performer of Mr. Vale's caliber deserves proper attention to his specific needs. I corresponded extensively with his representatives to ensure every detail was perfectly arranged." "His representatives," Finch repeated with growing interest. "Yet Mr. Dacre has informed us that he manages all of Mr. Vale's professional correspondence. With whom exactly did you communicate?" Mrs. Palfrey's hands fluttered nervously, disturbing more violet powder from her gloves, a detail that Miss Marple noted with characteristic discretion. "Dr. Hartwell's office, naturally. They provided detailed instructions regarding Mr. Vale's dietary restrictions and medication schedule." From the vicarage came the sharp trill of the telephone, and Mrs. Brett hurried inside with obvious relief at having clear purpose. She returned moments later with heightened color and obvious distress. "Inspector, That was the postmistress in Stourton. She remembers the gentleman who sent yesterday's telegram, distinguished silver-haired man who claimed to be Dr. Hartwell. He inquired specifically about bicycle routes to Little Dilling that would avoid the main roads. This information caused a subtle shift in the investigation's focus. Someone had been planning their approach with military precision, seeking concealment rather than the professional visibility one would expect from a legitimate medical consultation. Constable Bell, who had been conducting his methodical search of the garden's perimeter, called out with obvious excitement, "Inspector, found something buried near the compost heap. Looks like clothing that's been deliberately concealed." The group gathered around Bell's discovery. A gentleman's waistcoat bearing faint traces of violet powder and, most significantly, a small silver locket engraved with the initial H. Inspector Finch opened it carefully, revealing a photograph of a young woman with delicate features and eyes that seemed familiar despite the passage of years. Harold Dacre stared at the photograph with obvious recognition. "That's the locket Mr. Vale carried. He said it belonged to someone who should have had a different life. He never explained further, though he sometimes studied it with an expression of profound regret." Miss Marple examined the photograph with gentle attention, noting the quality of the studio work and the fashion details that suggested the portrait was perhaps 15 years old. "A beautiful young woman," she observed, "though there's something about the eyes, a quality of disappointment that speaks to experiences beyond her years." Dr. Reeves stepped closer, his medical training engaged by the systematic nature of the evidence. "Inspector, we're dealing with someone who possesses not only pharmaceutical expertise, but intimate knowledge of the victim's personal history and emotional vulnerabilities. This suggests a connection extending far beyond professional acquaintance." As the morning light continued to strengthen, transforming shadows into stark evidence, Miss Marple reflected that the evening's tragedy was revealing layers of deception that extended deep into the village's carefully maintained social fabric. The pianist who had played at midnight was indeed dead, but the true composition of guilt and innocence remained to be fully revealed through patient investigation and careful attention to the human heart's capacity for both love and vengeance. The lanterns had long since ceased their gentle swaying, but their memory lingered in the garden where music had so recently filled the air, now replaced by the quiet scratch of official notebooks and the whispered revelations of secrets too long concealed. The silver locket rested in Inspector Finch's palm like a small confession, its engraved initial catching the strengthening morning light with quiet accusation. The photograph within revealed a young woman whose delicate features and sorrowful eyes seemed to gaze out from the past with an expression of profound disappointment, a quality that Miss Marple had observed in certain faces throughout the morning's investigation. Harold Dacre accepted the locket with trembling hands, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of accumulated secrets. "Mr. Vale always carried this," he whispered, studying the photograph with obvious recognition. "He said it belonged to someone who should have had a different life. His sister, he once told me, though he never spoke her name. Only that her fate was tied to his early ambitions and the choices he made in pursuing success." The word sister created a moment of crystalline silence in the garden, where morning light was steadily transforming assumptions into stark evidence. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm as she observed the subtle reactions among the assembled villagers, noting how certain faces reflected recognition while others displayed careful blankness. Mrs. Brett, whose gentle manner often encouraged unexpected confidences, stepped forward with information that seemed to weigh heavily on her conscience. "The young lady in that photograph, she reminds me of the Hartwell family who lived here years ago. There was a daughter, though this isn't Lucy. The features are similar, but more delicate. I believe Lucy had a younger sister who was rather frail." Dr. Reeves examined the medical bag's contents with renewed understanding. "Inspector, If Mr. Vale had a sister, that would explain the intimate knowledge displayed by our mysterious Dr. Hartwell. Family members possessed detailed understanding of each other's habits, medical conditions, and emotional vulnerabilities, precisely what would be required for such calculated murder. Mrs. Palfrey, whose nervous energy had been building throughout the morning's revelations, suddenly swayed as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted. Her hands fluttered nervously, disturbing more violet powder from her gloves, a detail that had been accumulating significance throughout the investigation. "My dear," Mrs. Brett murmured with characteristic compassion, moving to support her, "you look quite unwell." "I'm perfectly fine," Mrs. Palfrey replied with forced brightness, though her voice carried the strain of someone maintaining composure through sheer will. "The morning has been rather overwhelming, what with these dreadful accusations and suggestions." Miss Marple observed this exchange with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth often emerged through careful observation of human behavior under stress. Mrs. Palfrey's distress seemed disproportionate to the morning's revelations, unless those revelations carried deeply personal rather than merely social significance. Inspector Finch opened his notebook with methodical precision. "Mrs. Palfrey, you mentioned corresponding extensively with Dr. Hartwell's office regarding Mr. Vale's specific requirements. These instructions included very particular details about his refreshments and the precise placement of his personal glass. Rather unusual for routine medical advice." The question caused Mrs. Palfrey's composure to show hairline cracks. "He was most thorough, Inspector. Said he was a distant relative, deeply concerned about Mr. Vale's health during this charitable endeavor. He even offered to contribute to our cause. Such generosity from a medical professional." Harold Dacre straightened with sudden recognition. "Inspector, I've just remembered something crucial. During our journey here, Mr. Vale mentioned receiving word that his sister had married well and established herself in a respectable community, somewhere in the countryside where her past wouldn't follow her. He seemed both relieved and melancholy about her transformation." "Her transformation," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, her gentle gaze moving between the locket's photograph and Mrs. Palfrey's increasingly pale complexion. "From one identity to another, such changes often require considerable effort and careful maintenance." Mrs. Brett approached with a discovery that seemed to illuminate the morning's accumulated mysteries. "Inspector, while organizing the charity committee's papers, I found something rather curious tucked behind Mrs. Palfrey's correspondence file, a birth certificate for one Elena Hartwell dated 37 years ago." The revelation settled over the garden like morning dew, visible and inescapable. The assembled villagers turned to stare at Mrs. Palfrey, Elena Hartwell, whose carefully constructed identity as village organizer was being stripped away to reveal deeper connections to the victim and more complex motivations than anyone had imagined. "Elena," Miss Marple said with gentle understanding, her voice carrying no accusation, only sad recognition. "You were the sister Sebastian carried in his locket, the one who deserved a different life." Mrs. Palfrey's hands stilled on her gloves, the violet powder no longer seeming like innocent cosmetic residue, but evidence of something far more sinister. Her carefully maintained composure began showing deeper cracks as the weight of exposure settled upon her shoulders. "He abandoned me," she said quietly, her voice carrying 15 years of accumulated resentment. "When father's embezzlement was discovered, Sebastian fled to London to build his glittering career while I faced the scandal alone. I married Mr. Palfrey to escape the shame, created this respectable life through careful effort and constant vigilance." Inspector Finch made careful notes, understanding that confessions often emerged in fragments before revealing their full scope. "And when you learned he would be performing here, you saw an opportunity." "I wrote to him as Dr. Hartwell, claiming medical authority to gain his trust and access to his arrangements. He never suspected that his devoted sister had become the very respectability he had fled." Her voice carried the bitter satisfaction of someone whose long-planned revenge was finally being acknowledged. Dr. Reeves stepped closer, his medical training engaged by the implications. The digitalis dosage, the violet masking agent, the precise timing, such knowledge requires considerable pharmaceutical expertise. Mr. Palfrey was a chemist before his retirement, Elena replied with quiet pride. His laboratory provided everything necessary, and his medical texts taught me exactly how much a particular heart could be made to bear. Miss Marple's knitting resumed its gentle rhythm as she reflected that family secrets, like garden weeds, often grew in unexpected directions, intertwining with other lives, until simple solutions became deceptively complex. The pianist who had played at midnight was indeed dead, but the true performance, one of sibling rivalry, abandoned loyalty, and carefully orchestrated revenge, was finally revealing its intricate score. As inspector, Finch prepared for the formal questioning that would complete this tragic composition. The garden seemed to exhale with the relief of secrets too long concealed finally finding their way into the peaceful morning light. Elena's confession hung in the morning air, but Miss Marple's gentle gaze remained troubled, her knitting needles pausing in their steady rhythm. The revelation of Sebastian's abandoned sister provided compelling emotional motive, yet certain practical elements remained as tangled as dropped stitches in an otherwise perfect pattern. "My dear Elena," Miss Marple said with characteristic gentleness, "your grief is perfectly understandable, and your brother's abandonment was indeed cruel. However, I find myself puzzled by certain mechanical aspects of last evening's events." Inspector Finch, recognizing that quality in Miss Marple's tone that had previously proved illuminating, reopened his notebook with renewed attention. "The medical knowledge, primarily," she continued thoughtfully. "The precise digitalis dosage required pharmaceutical expertise far beyond what domestic chemistry might provide. Too little would produce no effect, while too much would be immediately obvious despite the violet masking. Someone with professional medical training was essential to this enterprise." Dr. Reeves stepped forward, his weathered features showing the strain of the morning's revelations. "Miss Marple raises an excellent point. Such calculations require intimate understanding of cardiac medications and their interactions." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her gentle gaze moving to study the village physician with renewed interest. "Dr. Reeves, you've displayed remarkable knowledge of pharmaceutical dosages throughout this investigation, far beyond what routine village practice would typically require. And your immediate recognition of the digitalis residue suggested familiarity rather than professional deduction." The accusation hung unspoken but clearly understood. Dr. Reeves straightened with the dignity of someone whose carefully maintained secret was finally being exposed to daylight. "Margaret," Elena whispered, recognition dawning in her features. "Margaret Hartwell." Miss Marple nodded with gentle confirmation. "The third sister. Elena provided the motive and access, but Margaret provided the medical expertise necessary to ensure success. A family collaboration, one might say." Dr. Reeves, Margaret Hartwell, removed her medical bag with hands that trembled slightly. "I became a physician to heal, to make amends for the damage our family's disgrace had caused. But Sebastian's success was built on our sacrifice. Elena's shame, my exile from everything familiar, Lucy's broken heart." Harold Dacre stared at the assembled Hartwell sisters with obvious bewilderment. "Inspector, Mr. Vale often spoke of debts that could never be repaid, mistakes that cast longer shadows than success could illuminate. The Dr. Hartwell correspondence," Miss Marple continued with methodical precision, "was Elena's creation, but the medical details were Margaret's contribution. Together, they orchestrated Sebastian's return to the village where their father's disgrace had begun, ensuring his final performance would also be his last." Inspector Finch made careful notes as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. The violet powder in Miss Latimer's compact. That was deliberate misdirection? "Precisely," Miss Marple confirmed. Elena knew of Iris's past disappointment with Sebastian. She planted evidence to implicate the music teacher while Margaret provided the pharmaceutical knowledge to make the murder appear like natural cardiac failure. The bicycle tracks, the mysterious medical assistant, the carefully positioned evidence, all designed to create confusion while the true perpetrators remained hidden in plain sight. Elena lifted her chin with a defiance that seemed more weary than hopeful. "He took everything from us," she said quietly. "Our name, our family's honor, our futures. We merely ensured he paid the debt he owed." Margaret nodded with bitter satisfaction. "I dedicated my life to healing, but some wounds required different medicine. Sebastian's success was purchased with our suffering. It seemed only just that his finale should restore the balance." Miss Marple observed the two sisters with the patient understanding of someone who had witnessed the full spectrum of human nature's complexity. "Family secrets," she reflected gently, "like garden perennials, often lie dormant for years before blooming with unexpected intensity." Inspector Finch closed his notebook with professional finality. "Mrs. Palfrey, Dr. Reeves, I must place you both under arrest for the murder of Sebastian Vale." As Constable Bell led the Hartwell sisters away, Elena with her head held high despite the tears streaming down her face, Margaret with the resigned dignity of a physician who had violated her most sacred oath, a profound silence descended upon the vicarage garden. The assembled villagers dispersed quietly, their faces reflecting the sobering realization that beneath the surface of their peaceful community, old wounds could fester into something deadly. Miss Marple remained in her wicker chair, her gaze lingering on the empty space where the piano had stood, now just a patch of flattened grass in the strengthening morning light. Mrs. Brett approached with a fresh cup of tea, her gentle manner unchanged despite the morning's tragic revelations. "Such a dreadful business," she murmured. "One would never have suspected such darkness beneath our quiet routines." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, accepting the cup with gracious thanks, "though I've found that villages, like gardens, often harbor the most unexpected growths in their shadowed corners. The pianist who played at midnight has played his final composition, but the melody of human nature, with all its discordant notes of love, betrayal, and vengeance, continues as it always has." The lanterns had long since ceased their gentle swaying, but their memory lingered in the garden where music had so recently filled the air. The vicarage clock chimed the quarter hour, and somewhere beyond the lane, life continued its ancient rhythm. The village would return to its peaceful routines, but the memory of that night and the unsettling truth it had revealed about the depths of family loyalty and the price of abandoned love would linger like an echo long after the last note had faded into silence. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the gentle click of her needles a small, steady counterpoint to the morning's lingering unease. She had seen enough of human nature to know that such tragedies were neither rare nor entirely preventable, but she took quiet satisfaction in knowing that justice, like truth, had a way of emerging into the light when patient observation met the inevitable moment of revelation.